I'm excited about this topic because it really has to do with kind of thinking through details, and it has important implications as far as just kind of filling in some more notches as to why the Gospels are true and frankly pretty amazing, I think. So, yeah, we want to think a little bit like historians this morning, and I want to go through a couple of details that may be new for you, maybe you've seen some of them before, but I think hopefully the first part that we're going to get into is going to be kind of new. And I want to sort of present that starting with kind of two views, and maybe I'll read these quickly. So the first is a quote from C.S. Lewis, the second is a quote from Bart Ehrman. So C.S. Lewis, unlike myself, who's not very influential, who was quite an influential Christian and wrote quite prolifically. And then Bart Ehrman is also a historian who is Jewish and who I think was a Christian and now is not a Christian, and because of various reasons. He says we can't get the originals for the Gospels, but C.S. Lewis said that this is sort of his classic trifecta quote about liar, Lord, lunatic about Jesus. So let me just read this to you quickly. He says, "I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. This is the one thing we must not say. A man who is merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level with the man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him, you can kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let's not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He did not leave that open to us, he didn't intend to." So C.S. Lewis is basically saying, right, either you're going to call him Lord, liar, or he's crazy. So there's sort of these three options. But now Bart Ehrman comes on the scene and says this: the New Testament Gospels were written 35 to 65 years after Jesus' death, not by people who were eyewitnesses, but by people living after. Where do these people get their information from? And that's sort of the key question that I want to focus on this morning. It's a really important question. After the days of Jesus, people started telling stories about him in order to convert others to the faith. Stories are in circulation year after year, and as a result, they get changed. Imagine playing telephone, right? Not in the solitary room with kids on some sunny afternoon, but in the Roman Empire, some 2,500 miles across, with thousands of participants from different backgrounds, cultures, languages, etc., etc. And what would happen to the stories? So that's sort of his analogy is this is sort of telephone gone awry, right? Just gone crazy. And so the point is that he's saying, look, legend it's not just liar, Lord, lunatic, it's now we have a fourth L, that the Gospels are effectively legend. So we can't necessarily believe what they say about Christ because they probably got skewed and changed over time. And so I don't think this is actually the best analogy, and lots of people who study history would disagree with Bart strongly on this point, and I think I just disagree strongly, is that the spread of Christianity is not really like telephone. Can anyone think about why? Maybe we'll take 2 seconds. Why is that a bad analogy? Think about telephone. How does the game go? Well, yeah, okay, exactly. Broken telephone, fine, but I mean, what is it? You sit in like a circle. How does it go?
One person tells it to one other person,
and then they keep telling it around, right? And sort of, I guess, what's kind of the difference? I guess.
It wasn't just verbal; it's written sometimes.
Okay. What else? I mean, how significant is the message in telephone typically?
The intention of telephone is usually to distort the message,
Exactly.
or for the fun of the game, which is way different from this.
So I like how Peter Williams says the spread of Christianity, I like his analogy, is more like karate. Right? You don't typically hear of karate being corrupted. Why? Because there's disciplines, there's a certain set of piece of information that people are studying and really wanting to pass on, as opposed to, this is that. It's more like there's a very strong intention to keep things the way they were. And so I think that's a better analogy. Anyway, let's get into some more here. So scholars in early tradition agree that the Gospels were written outside Palestine. For example, John could have been written in Asia Minor, like Mark in Rome, Syria, other places like this. And the question is, how familiar were the Gospel writers with the land? If you never visited a place, how can you write about it intelligently? So like, could you write about a story, say, in Lebanon that happened 100 years ago? I mean, you may know about Beirut, the capital, but would you know about details about like little sub-villages there, traveling times, local cultures, what people were called, things like that? That's what we want to look at today. So here's the piece I think that may be new to most people. It was new to me a few years ago, and I think it's really, really interesting. So the question is, did they get the names right? And this has to do with the study of the history of names, onomastics. So there's a really cool resource. This woman, Tal Ilan, she's a Palestinian woman who basically did research for, it took her, I don't know, maybe 20 years of compiled research, and she developed this lexicon of Jewish names in antiquity. In 2002, she published it. You can buy it on Amazon if you want. And basically, it's a study of about 3,000 names, and she looks at using archaeology, so the New Testament, Josephus' writings, who was an early Jewish historian, epigraphs on ossuaries, so like inscriptions on bone boxes, right? And Dead Sea Scrolls. And basically, she sort of pools together the popularity of names. Actually, I want to hand this out if you want to pass this out. Writing's a little small, but you can take that with you. That's my parting gift. Also, so that's a source I'm going to use, as well as Richard Buckham, who's a British scholar, wrote a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, and he takes a lot of the data from Tal Ilan's study and sort of applies it to the New Testament. And check this out. So, what's sort of the distribution of names in terms of relative popularity in Palestine around that time? And this is what, this is Ilan's data. This is what she found. So check it out. Simeon is the most popular, then Joseph, then Lazarus. So you see the frequency, 243 of those. And you can see kind of the distribution across the different data sources as well. So Simon, Joseph, Lazarus, Judas, and John, these are the Jesus' top 6 names in Palestine at that time from her research. So check this out. So on the right-hand side, so that's included in the data, but if you separate them and you look at first century Palestine without the New Testament information, okay, you see that Simon and Joseph were the 2 most popular names, with about 15.6% of men were named this. And the Gospels and Acts, you have almost a similar percentage, about 18%. If you look at the 9 most popular names in first century Palestine, the top 9, that comprises about 41% of all males. The distribution in the New Testament is about 40%. Men attest to only one source. It's pretty close. When you get into the women, it's a little bit different, because there's just frankly less information about women's names back then. So the data sample is much smaller, and the variations a little bit more. But there's a pretty good matchup there, as you can see. And this may not seem that interesting to you, but it's sort of, again, think about it in the context of how would you know what people are called? Unless you're writing the truth about what actually happened, how would you get this proportion of names right? That's the question. And to strengthen it, let's look at Jews in the diaspora, particularly in Egypt. Let's look at what were the popular names at that time versus the New Testament. So check this out here. So Lazarus was the top, or Eleazar, and that's number 3 in Palestine. The second one is Sabbatius, or I don't know how you actually pronounce it, That's ranked number 68 in Palestine, right? So that wasn't a popular name in Palestine. Joseph, okay, is up there, and then you have a bunch of these other names, Dositheus, Pappus, Ptolemaeus. So you can see that there's, just sort of the names that show up as the top 6. A number of them are quite different, and you don't even see them in the New Testament at all. Does that make sense? What do you guys think? So it's not proof. It's just sort of this interesting connection between looking at frequency of names in Palestine versus the New Testament. There's a nice match, as opposed to looking at some other place in the same time period. The way they named people in Egypt was a little bit different, right? How that happened, and you see that with the names. So, let me keep cruising here. Any questions about that, actually? How much time do I have? Good. Any questions about that? Have you seen that before? So I think it's a really cool study in terms of, Richard Buckham basically took Elon's data and started thinking about how this applies to the New Testament. So it's just a really interesting, again, it's sort of this, another interesting kind of notch in if you say the gospel writers were too smart, or if you have to start you have to be careful with the balance of, were they so clever that they were making things up and they knew about this proportion of names? I doubt it. Right? But on the other hand, were they just making up stories? It's like, well, how could you make up a story and it matches this proportion of names so well? It doesn't seem to, especially if it's touted that you weren't in the country, right? You weren't writing from Palestine, you're writing 1,000 miles away or something like that. How would you know that this is what people are named? Could you even, 100 years ago, could you figure out what the proportion of names are in Norton? What's the most popular, what were the 6 most popular names here? Do you know?
Well,
I mean,
most popular are all
Norton as a township, as opposed to okay. Bad example. My bad. I should have known that.
See, they knew what that historians would be looking at this 2,000 years later.
Exactly. That's what they planned. So that's how smart they were. Right? They're really intelligent. So you got to sort of take it from what perspective are you going to do it. So this is another really interesting thing as well. Disambiguation, meaning the right feature of names. So in our family, we have, my wife is Daniela and my brother's wife is Daniela. So it's like, if I said Daniela and they're both in the room, who am I talking to, right? How would you know? How would they know? So you could say like, Peter's Daniela or Dan's Daniela, or you could say Daniela with 2 L's, my wife has 2 L's, the other Daniela has 1 L. I mean, you have to somehow distinguish it because no one knows. So this is really interesting. How it goes. So what I want you to think about and just kind of follow along here is, so remember, John is the 5th most popular name in Palestine at this time. And let's just kind of work through this passage really fast and see how the narrator is distinguished from how the characters speak. Okay, so in the beginning it's talking about, Herod, this is about Herod, and he says to his servants, this is John the Baptist. So he's not just saying this is John the Baptist, specifying who it is. And then look what happens. So he's talking, right? This is how he talks. And then in verse 3, the narrator kicks in. It says, for Herod had seized John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. So John the Baptist has been introduced, so the narrator is not going to keep saying John the Baptist. That makes sense. But let's go on. Look what happens now. So remember, but when Herod's birthday, see verse 6 came, the daughter of Herodias danced before the company and pleased Herod, so that he promised with an oath to give her what she might ask. Prompted by her mother, she said, give me the head of who? She doesn't say John, right? Because then maybe one of the guards would be like, I'm John. Whose head's coming off, right? She was very clear. Give me the head of John the Baptist. So this is like just what you would expect if John was a popular name. You would see that they would have to disambiguate from other Johns. This is sort of just this very natural way that it would happen. And the narrator wouldn't have to keep saying John the Baptist because that's the context. Right? So this is a really interesting little detail. There's another one. Distinguishing within the group. So there were two James, two Simons, apparently two Judases if you look at Luke's list, depending. Who else? Two of somebody else, right? Is that right? Or at least two of those guys. So it's like, look how the 12 apostles are. Look at the kind of the add-ons for their names. So Simon is distinguished as Peter, as opposed to Simon the Zealot, right? These guys are very different. James, son of Alphaeus, versus James, the son of Zebedee. So what's interesting is, so this is what Buckham points out. These aren't distinguishing them from other people in society, like in Jerusalem and in the surrounding areas, because they could have always been called one of the 12, right? This is more of a within group distinguishing. Again, as I was talking about, like my wife and my brother's wife, just to have normal conversation and things to make sense, we have to distinguish who is who if they have the same name, especially with the more popular names. So if there's two Simons, we're going to distinguish Simon Peter and Simon the Zealot, and it just makes sense, right? We can't just say Simon and Simon because we don't know who you're talking about. But again, this seems to be an in-group sort of construction, and it seems very natural as well. I don't know, does that make sense? How about this? How about names for the main character? So stop me if you have questions, all right? I think we're doing fine on time. So, Christian writing. 4 Gospels use Jesus frequently, and the Gospel of Thomas, but not really in the other Gnostic-type Gospels. How about non-Christian accounts? So look, you have Tacitus, Roman, writing about the fire in Rome that was attributed to the Christians, apparently, and talks about their sort of leader back in the day, Christus, he calls him. Pliny writes about Christus, Josephus, Jesus who was called the Christ. Paul even uses Christ way more than Jesus in his writings, which is interesting, right? Jesus is frequently used much more in the 4 Gospels than in so Paul is different. Paul did not hang out with Jesus, or at least maybe didn't get his information in the same way. But it shows that later, especially in non-Christian accounts, Christus was sort of the main distinguishing name for Christ, or for Jesus. So check this out. How do the gospel writers use it? So Jesus was the 6th ranked name in that region at that time. Maybe we could have some people look up these verses, actually, since you have Bibles. I'm glad you brought Bibles. I didn't want to write all this out. It's kind of a lot to look at. But maybe we could have, let's see. Can we just have volunteers to pick up Matthew 21, 6, 11, and 12? And maybe read that. We can go through that. And then someone else take 26, and then Matthew 27. I'm not going to pick people. Who has got Matthew 21? Go ahead. So read verse 6.
11 and 12, huh?
Yeah, and 11 and 12.
Okay, verse 6. The disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. Verse 11 says...
That's to get the colt. They're going to get the donkey so he can ride into Jerusalem.
Right. So, yeah. So, okay. And then verse 11, the crowds...
Now the crowd's talking.
The crowds, yeah. This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee. And then verse 12, and Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who sold and bought in the temple.
Now you see, so the narrator is talking in verse 6 and 12, and he's just saying Jesus. How did the crowd speak in verse 11? Jesus is writing in. They don't just say, this is Jesus. Why do they say something else?
Just ambiguation.
Yeah. This is Jesus of Nazareth, right? Why? Because there's other Jesuses in the crowd, probably. There's other Jesuses around. So it's like they're this is Jesus of Nazareth. We're not talking about any old Jesus, yeah.
And I also find it interesting that Nazareth is a very small village.
Yes.
Maybe 100 or 200 people, and it's like 2-3 days journey from Jerusalem. So chances are that someone else named Jesus is from Nazareth in Jerusalem at that time is, there's no other, so that's really enough to distinguish him. But there's a lot of other Jesuses around, like you're saying, but only one Jesus from Nazareth probably at that time
Yeah, that's a good point.
walking around.
Yeah, but you see how the narrator and the crowds speak differently. And again, it's in a very natural way. It just seems like it flows really well and it's very clear. How about Matthew 26? Who's got that? There you go.
Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came up to him and said, "You also were with Jesus the Galilean."
Okay, and then 71.
And when he went out to the entrance, another servant girl saw him and said to the bystanders, "This man was Jesus of Nazareth."
And then 75.
And Peter remembered the saying of Jesus, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly.
Again, it's the consistency. The last one is the narrator saying, Peter, remember what Jesus said. The first two are just people coming up to Peter and saying, you're with Jesus, the Galilean. Then another one got a little bit more specific, right? You're with Jesus of Nazareth, right? So again, same idea. How about Matthew 27? Thank you. Matthew 27. Let's read these 3 quickly, just to make sure you see I'm not making this up. We could read through the Gospels all day and see this. But it's a good thing to start thinking about in your mind, right? Who's got Matthew 27? Go for it.
Verse 17, so when they had gathered, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?"
Again, let's see how Pilate's clarifying who he's talking about. Very important at that point, right? No, it's not me. I'm Jesus. I didn't do anything. Not that. Not that Jesus. The other one. 22.
Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?" They all said, "Let him be crucified."
And again, that's a very specific. This is Messiah, right? He's taught. It's a very specific disambiguation for the context and the accusation too, right? So it fits quite well. Keep going. 37.
And over his head they put the charge against him, which read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews."
Again, same idea. How about 28:5? Can you hit that quickly? This is the angel talking. So even the angel felt a need to disambiguate, apparently.
But the angel said to the woman, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus, who was crucified."
Yeah, that's it. Anyways, I think we get the point. You see narrator, individuals, crowds speak differently for obvious reasons. And it's sort of exactly how you would hope people would speak in a way that's making sense and, and a sort of logically clear message getting across. It doesn't have the flavor of something that's made up and there's these weird inconsistencies. And this is the same pattern you see in all the other Gospels. This is really interesting too. Let's keep cruising here. How does Jesus speak? It is really, really fascinating. Notice he never teaches on Gentile inclusion or church order, which would have been super important themes, right? If you're writing back on these things quite a bit later.
Another really important thing would be circumcision.
Oh yeah, yeah.
He never said anything.
That's right. Man, yeah, what a theme, right? The other thing, and I think this is really cool, he
But
doesn't.
Can you expand on what that means? What does it mean that he didn't teach about that? I mean, why is that significant?
Well, I guess the idea that was later on, that was an issue in the church, right? This is one of Paul's big themes. He's writing to Rome, right? You have Jews, you have Gentiles, you have all these Jews who are rejecting the gospel. It's like, how do they get along? Should the Jews be? I guess maybe just the point is just that these are significant themes later on. Church order, how should we run things? How should what should it look like? He doesn't really talk about that. I guess that's the point.
So if the church had made up the Gospels, they would have
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
put that into his mouth.
Probably, right.
Yeah.
It seems like they would have, because these were issues that were divisive, even early on, right? Does that, I mean, I guess you answered the question better than I did.
You're doing fine.
Thanks. He uses parables, and the early church doesn't use these, so why would they make them up for Jesus? That's so weird. It doesn't make any sense, right? The early church doesn't teach in parables, so why would we make up this way of teaching for Jesus? Either you're super clever, just to throw people off the trail, or that's actually what happened, right? I don't know, have you ever thought about that before? It's strange. And how about this? His favorite self-reference is Son of Man, coming from Daniel, right? But the early church doesn't use this. So once again, it's like, why would you have this special designation for Jesus calling himself Son of Man, but then you never use it anymore? Let's keep going. Make sense? So this is kind of cool too. Let's get out of the names for a second and talk about some local knowledge. So, contemporary towns that are listed in the four Gospels, there's quite a few of them, but this is sort of the frequency that they show up in the four Gospels. Jerusalem, obviously, is talked about a lot. You have Nazareth, Capernaum, these are the top three in terms of frequency and being mentioned. And then you have all these little guys, but significant number, 512, Bethany, Bethlehem, Bethsaida, Jericho, Sidon, Tyre. And then you have, again, all these other ones that get mentioned a little bit less, but get mentioned. And these are real places there, right? Like Nain, and Magadan, and Cana, and Sychar, and all these other places, right? So, check this out. How would someone in Syria, Rome, or Turkey, writing about these things 100 years later, know? How would they know about these villages? Let's compare with the other apocryphal Gospels, like Gospel of Philip, Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Mary, all these other guys. So the four Gospels, there's about 12 to 14 total towns. They mention about 12 to 14 towns each, and in total about 23 different towns. Okay, Gospel of Philip's got... Gospel of Philip got the capital right, but Nazareth it thinks is Jesus' middle name for some reason. So it's a little bit weird. I don't know how to take that. Gospel of Peter and the Savior, they got the capital right. And then in 13 other 2nd and 3rd century Gospels, they don't mention any towns. Period. So again, if you were writing a story about some country you didn't know that much about, you probably could get the capital right. But how would you get all the other surrounding little villages that only local people would know about? So it's just an interesting little thing to point out. I want to just say a couple things about that if I remember. Give me 1 second. Yeah, so this is pretty interesting. These Gnostic or false Gospels really are the controlled experiment for what it would look like if people were making up stories, right? Which I think is kind of cool. You have this local knowledge, the Synoptic Gospels and John and Acts. You have this detailed kind of description of local places, names included, and then you have the other Gospels barely getting the capital right or nothing. And again, I just think it really gives evidence to this is the controlled experiment to what it would look like if someone was trying to really make things up. So, let's go, I want to do kind of a case study on the feeding of the 5,000. So we have about 7 minutes left, I guess. So, maybe you can make your Bibles ready because we're going to have to go back and forth. So I need some people in Mark 6 and in Luke 9. And we'll get to John 6 in a second, all right? So it's in all four Gospels. So again, the point is, with this as an example, you can't prove the miracle happened, but you can examine what info they include about the whole story. Right? This is the whole kind of question. Did it come from people making things up? Or did it come from eyewitnesses who had very good local knowledge and were passing it on to the people who were writing? Let's see. So how do you count? Right? Were the disciples just sort of like, it's like, kind of have the Amish plumb bob, right? It's like, it's level. How did they figure? They're just like, there's a million people there. I don't know. How did they figure it out?
Overhead drone?
Yeah, exactly. Overhead drone. So look at Mark. Can someone read Mark 6:39 through 40? And then someone else read Luke 9:14 and 15. Don't be shy. Let's go.
Mark 6 what?
Mark 6:39 and 40.
Then he commanded them to make them all sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in ranks, in hundreds and fifties.
Okay. And then how about Luke 9? He says what? 14 and 15? What does he say?
For about 5,000 men were there. Then he told his disciples, have them sit down in groups of 50 each. They did so, and he had them all sit down.
Okay, let's say there were groups of 50s, all right? For the least size of the groups. So you got about 100 groups of men, right? Divide that by 12. So 12 disciples, right? How many is that per disciple? It's about 8, right? 8.33333333333.
Stop.
I'm just kidding. Right? So I think they could count to 8. They're fishermen, right? They weren't schooled, but they could count to 8, I'm sure, right? So counting seems to make sense. I think it seems logical. How about grass? So, forgot your first name.
Caleb.
Caleb? Grass. What did you read? They sat down and what was the grass?
They sat down in groups on the green grass.
Oh, the green grass, yeah. And what is John? Someone look at John 6. I forgot the verse. Maybe you can find the grass. Anyway, I'll just say it's grass. Well, keep your finger in John 6. So both of them mention grass. We'll come back to the grass in a second. How about many coming and going? Mark 6:31 says many are coming and going, right? Anyone know why? Why would many be coming and going?
They're hungry, they have children, I don't know.
Well, look at John. Let's go to John 6. I can't remember the verse, but maybe someone can help me find it. I apologize, I didn't put it there.
What, the grass?
No, but the many coming and going. We'll get back to the grass. What is it? John says it was what? Near what time? Less specific. The
Verse
season.
4. Verse 4, yeah. John 6:4.
Near the Passover.
John 6:4. Yes, thank you.
Passover.
It's Passover time, which makes sense because you got lots of people coming and going. Lots of people flooding into Jerusalem, right? It's like Buckeye football in Columbus, right? You got 100,000 extra people descending on the city. Crazy time. Right, so that makes sense. How about why would Jesus ask Philip about where we're going to get food for all these people? Do you know the answer already?
Philip was from Bethsaida.
Yeah, but how do you know that? It doesn't say that in John, right?
It's in
In the beginning, anyway.
John chapter 1.
John chapter 1 says that, but then John also, so in John, Philip and Andrew both reply too, right?
Yes.
Why does Andrew reply?
Brothers? No, that's Peter and Andrew.
Look at John 1:44. Again, just interesting little details.
City for the same.
Philip and Andrew are both from Bethsaida, right? And that's near where they are.
Oh, yeah.
Which is interesting, a little detail. They both speak because they know. I mean, otherwise it's so random. Like, why would Andrew speak up? He wasn't even asked, right? I mean, maybe he was, but they didn't record that. But it makes sense that he's saying something. He's like, hey, I grew up right here, so I know where we can get some food. Or at least I know that it would be impossible to get food. Luke says the feeding is near Bethsaida. John 1, we just read, Philip and Andrew are from Bethsaida. The point is, if you're reading John alone, you miss this. But together, to take the Gospels together, these details start cohering in a story that really seems to make sense and be tough to make up. How about barley loaves? What's the significance of barley loaves? John says something about that, right? You can scan the verses quickly. The barley harvest was near the Passover, right? So this was why they're having barley loaves. How about green grass? Was the grass really green? Or was Mark just kind of feeling extra poetic?
Passover, springtime.
Yeah, they just had like the last 5 months of the most rain that they had in the season, right? So the grass would have been green. The point is that the Gospels come together to build a narrative that really seems credible. And there's a lot more to talk about, but I guess I just want to sort of end with this. We looked at the proportion of names. They got proportion of names right. That matches this really incredible source of this Israeli woman who did a ton of research using archaeology, other old texts, to figure out sort of what's the distribution or frequency of names in Palestine at that time. The New Testament matches that very nicely. The New Testament doesn't match another region, Egypt, for example, where you have Jewish names that are different. What else did we look at? We looked at also the way the narrator spoke, the way the people spoke, the way the stories are told. It just seems very natural, and you're distinguishing people in a very logical way. In a way that seems like, again, you couldn't make up. And then also you add to that all the local knowledge about where towns are, about seasons, about local villages, about who's from where, etc., etc. So there's a narrative that seems really credible, and it seems to be rooted from those who are very familiar with the events and culture and locale. So this is the quote I was talking about, by the way, with the boys' philosophies. But I really like this. I really think this applies. Reality and fact, this is something C.S. Lewis said, is usually something you could not have guessed. That is one of the reasons I believe Christianity. It is a religion you could not have guessed. If it offered us just the kind of universe we had always expected, I should feel we were making it up. But in fact, it is not the sort of thing anyone would have made up. It has just that queer twist about it that real things have. And I think that's kind of what I've been talking about the whole time, is this little twist that real things have. All these little details that you'd be like, like why would the women be recorded to the first ones to say that Jesus resurrected? I think that's a great example of that queer twist that you wouldn't put in there because it wouldn't strengthen your argument unless it's true. So let us leave behind all these boys' philosophies, these over-simple answers. The problem is not simple, and the answer is not going to be simple either. Yes, that's right. And I think I'm out of time.
I want to ask,
Yeah.
did they use last names at all?
I don't know.
That was John the Baptist, it was not John the Baptist.
No, John. It was just the Baptist as a distinguishing feature of who he was, as opposed to. I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know much about last names.
I had a similar question that word Christ is like saying Messiah, right? We get used to it like a second name, but
It means Messiah. That's right. Yeah.
I was going to say Paul's distinction in using Christ as opposed to Jesus. He's making a theological statement, not just simply a definition of who this person is.
Yeah, that's right. And his letters aren't narrative either, right? He's writing a letter typically of theological importance as well as addressing specific problems and to people in churches. And so the Gospels are much different, as it's more of a kind of a biography, right? About who Jesus was and what he did, as opposed to sort of applying that. Other questions? Okay, thanks a lot.